Illustrated by Mori. Terran's wait to meet Svance. The sun warmed Mark Howell's back pleasantly. Underfoot, the moss-like stuff was soft and yielding, and there was a fragrance in the air unlike anything he had ever smelled. He was going to like this planet, he knew it. The question was, how would it, and its people, like him? He watched the little figures advancing across the fields from the mound, with the village out of sight on the other end of it and the combat car circling lazily on contragravity above. Major Luis Gofredo, the Marine officer, spoke without lowering his binoculars. They have a tubular thing about 12 feet long, 6 of them are carrying it on poles, 3 to a side, and a couple more are walking behind it. Mark, do you think it could be a cannon? So far, he didn't know enough to have an opinion, and said so, adding, "What I saw of the village in the screen from the car, it looked pretty primitive. Of course, gunpowder's one of those things a primitive people could discover by accident, if the ingredients were available." "We won't take any chances, then." "You think they're hostile?" "I was hoping they were coming out to parley with us." That was Paul Millard. He had a right to be anxious. His whole future in the Colonial Office would be made or ruined by what was going to happen here. The Joint Space Navy Colonial Office expedition was looking for new planets suitable for colonization. They had been out, now, for 4 years, which was close to maximum for an exploring expedition. They had entered 11 systems, and made landings on 8 planets. 3 had been reasonably close to Terra type. There had been Fafnir, conditions there would correspond to Terra during the Cretaceous period, but any Cretaceous dinosaur would have been cute and cuddly to the things on Fafnir. Then there had been Imhotep. In 20 or 30,000 years, it would be a fine planet, but at present it was undergoing an extensive glaciation. And Irminsul, covered with forests of gigantic trees, it would have been fine except for the fauna, which was nasty, especially a race of subsapient near-humanoids who had just gotten as far as clubs and kudapoing axes. Contact with them had entailed heavy ammunition expenditure, with 2 men and a woman killed and a dozen injured. He'd had a limp, himself, for a while as a result. As for the other 5, one had been an all-out hell planet, and the rest had been the sort that get colonized by irreconcilable minority groups who want to get away from everybody else. The Colonial Office wouldn't even consider any of them. Then they had found this one, third of a G0 star, 80 million miles from primary, less axial inclination than Terra, which would mean a more uniform year-round temperature, and about half land surface. On the evidence of a couple of sneak landings for specimens, the biochemistry was identical with Terra's and the organic matter was edible. It was the sort of planet every explorer dreams of finding, except for one thing. It was inhabited by a sapient humanoid race, and some of them were civilized enough to put it in Class V, and Colonial Office doctrine on Class V planets was rigid. Friendly relations with the natives had to be established, and permission to settle had to be guaranteed in a treaty of some sort with somebody more or less authorized to make one. If Paul Millard could accomplish that, he had it made. He would stay on with 40 or 50 of the ship's company to make preparations. In a year a couple of ships would come out from Terra, with 1,000 colonists, and a battalion or so of Federation troops, to protect them from the natives and vice versa. Millard would automatically be appointed Governor General. But if he failed, he was through. Not out, just through. When he got back to Terra, he would be promoted to some home office position at slightly higher base pay but without the 300% extraterrestrial bonus, and he would vegetate there till he retired. Every time his name came up, somebody would say, "Oh, yes, he flubbed the contact on Watset." It wouldn't do the rest of them any good, either. There would always be the suspicion that they had contributed to the failure. Svance come out to meet Terrans. Bwawawanan. The wavering sound hung for an instant in the air. A few seconds later, it was repeated, then repeated again. Our cannon's a horn, Goffredo said. I can't see how they're blowing it, though. There was a stir to right and left, among the Marines deployed in a crescent line on either side of the contact team, a metallic clatter as weapons were checked. A shadow fell in front of them as a combat car moved into position above. What do you suppose it means? Mylord wondered. Terrans, go home. He drew a frown from Mylord with the suggestion. Maybe it's supposed to intimidate us. They're probably doing it to encourage themselves, Anna de Jong, the psychologist, said. I'll bet they're really scared stiff. I see how they're blowing it, Goffredo said. The man who's walking behind it has a hand bellows. He raised his voice. Fix bayonets. These people don't know anything about rifles, but they know what spears are. They have some of their own. So they had. The 6 who walked in the lead were unarmed, unless the thing one of them carried was a spear. So, it seemed, were the hornbearers. Behind them, however, in an open-order skirmish line, came 50-odd with weapons. Most of them had spears, the points glinting redly. Bronze, with a high copper content. A few had bows. They came slowly, details became more plainly visible. The leader wore a long yellow robe, the thing in his hand was a bronze-headed staff. 3 of his companions also wore robes, the other 2 were bare-legged in short tunics. The horn-bearers wore either robes or tunics, the spearmen and bowmen behind either wore tunics or were naked except for breechclouts. All wore sandals. They were red-brown in color, completely hairless, they had long necks, almost chinless lower jaws, and fleshy, beak-like noses that gave them an avian appearance which was heightened by red crests, like roosters' combs, on the tops of their heads. Well, aren't they something to see? Lillian Ransby, the linguist, asked. I wonder how we look to them, Paul Mylord said. That was something to wonder about, too. The differences between one and another of the Terrans must puzzle them. Paul Mylord, as close to being a pure Negro as anybody in the 7th century of the atomic era was to being pure anything. Lillian Ransby, almost ash-blonde. Major Goffredo, barely over the minimum service height requirement, his name was Old Terran Spanish, but his ancestry must have been Polynesian, Amarant, and Mongolian. Carl Dorver, the sociographer, 6 feet 6, with red hair. Bennett Fayon, the biologist and physiologist, plump, pink-faced and balding. Willie Schallenmacher, with a bushy black beard. They didn't have any ears, he noticed, and then he was taking stock of the things they wore and carried. Belts, with pouches, and knives with flat bronze blades and riveted handles. 3 of the delegation had small flutes hung by cords around their necks, and a 4th had a reed panpipe. No shields, and no swords, that was good. Swords and shields mean organized warfare, possibly a warrior caste. This crowd weren't warriors. The spearmen and bowmen weren't arrayed for battle, but for a drive hunt, with the bows behind the spears to stop anything that broke through the line. All right, let's go meet them. The querulous, uncertain note was gone from Mylord's voice, he knew what to do and how to do it. Goffredo called to the Marines to stand fast. Then they were advancing to meet the natives, and when they were 20 feet apart, both groups halted. The horn stopped blowing. The one in the yellow robe lifted his staff and said something that sounded like, Tweedledee-loodly Inc. The horn, he saw, was made of strips of leather, wound spirally and coated with some kind of varnish. Everything these people had was carefully and finely made. An old culture, but a static one. Probably tradition-bound as all get out. Millard was raising his hands. Solemnly he addressed the natives. 'Twas Brillig and the slithy toves were whooping it up in the Malamute saloon, and the kid that handled the music box did gyre and gimble in the wabe, and back of the bar in a solo game all Mimsy were the Borogovs, and the Mome Raths outgave the lady that's known as Lou. That was supposed to show them that we, too, have a spoken language, to prove that their language and ours were mutually incomprehensible, and to demonstrate the need for devising a means of communication. At least that was what the book said. It demonstrated nothing of the sort to this crowd. It scared them. The dignitary with the staff twittered excitedly. One of his companions agreed with him at length. Another started to reach for his knife, then remembered his manners. The bellowsman pumped a few blasts on the horn. "What do you think of the language?" he asked Lillian. "They all sound that bad, when you first hear them. Give them a few seconds, and then we'll have phase 2. When the gibbering and squeaking began to fall off, she stepped forward. Lillian was, herself, a good test of how human aliens were. This gang weren't human enough to whistle at her. She touched herself on the breast. "Me," she said. The natives seemed shocked. She repeated the gesture and the word, then turned and addressed Paul Millard. "You." "Me," Millard said, pointing to himself. Then he said, "You," to Luis Gofredo. It went around the contact team. When it came to him, he returned it to point of origin. "I don't think they get it at all," he added in a whisper. "They ought to," Lillian said. "Every language has a word for self and a word for person addressed." "Well, look at them," Karl Dorver invited. 6 different opinions about what we mean, and now the band's starting an argument of their own. "Phase 2A," Lillian said firmly, stepping forward. She pointed to herself. "Me, Lillian Ransby." "Lillian Ransby, me name." "You name?" "Bo," the spokesman screamed in horror, clutching his staff as though to shield it from profanation. The others howled like a hound pack at a full moon, except one of the short-tunic boys, who was slapping himself on the head with both hands and yodeling. The horn crew hastily swung their piece around at the Terrans, pumping frantically. "What do you suppose I said?" Lillian asked. "Oh, something like, 'Curse your gods, death to your king, and spit in your mother's face,' I suppose." "Let me try it," Gofredo said. The little Marine major went through the same routine. At his first word, the uproar stopped. Before he was through, the natives' faces were sagging and crumbling into expressions of utter and heartbroken grief. "It's not as bad as all that, is it?" he said. "You try it, Mark." "Me? Mark? Howl?" They looked bewildered. "Let's try objects, and play acting," Lillian suggested. "They're farmers, they ought to have a word for water." They spent almost an hour at it. They poured out 2 gallons of water, pretended to be thirsty, gave each other drinks. The natives simply couldn't agree on the word, in their own language, for water. That or else they missed the point of the whole act. They tried fire, next. The efficiency of a steel hatchet was impressive, and so was the sudden flame of a pocket lighter, but no word for fire emerged either. "Ah, to Niflheim with it!" Luis Gofredo cried in exasperation. "We're getting nowhere at 5 times light speed. Give them their presents and send them home, Paul." "Sheath knives, they'll have to be shown how sharp they are," he suggested. "Red bandanas. And costume jewelry." "How about something to eat, Bennett?" Millard asked Phaon. XD3, and CH trade candy, Phaon said. Field ration, extraterrestrial service, type 3, could be eaten by anything with a carbon-hydrogen metabolism, and so could the trade candy. Nothing else, though, till we have some idea what goes on inside them. Dorver thought the 6 members of the delegation would be persons of special consequence, and should have something extra. That was probably so. Dorver was as quick to pick up clues to an alien social order as he was, himself, to deduce a culture pattern from a few artifacts. He and Lillian went back to the landing craft to collect the presents. Everybody, horn detail, armed guard and all, got one 10-inch Bowie knife and sheath, a red bandana neckcloth, and a piece of flashy junk jewelry. The town council? Prominent citizens? Or what also received a colored table spread apiece. These were draped over their shoulders and fastened with 2-inch plastic pins advertising the candidacy of somebody for president of the Federation member Republic of Venus a couple of elections ago. They all looked woebegone about it. That would be their expression of joy. Different type nerves and different facial musculature, Phaon thought. As soon as they sampled the XT3 and candy, they looked crushed under all the sorrows of the galaxy. By pantomime and pointing to the sun, Millard managed to inform them that the next day, when the sun was in the same position, the Terrans would visit their village, bringing more gifts. The natives were quite agreeable, but Millard was disgruntled that he had to use sign talk. The natives started off toward the village on the mound, munching XT3 and trying out their new knives. This time tomorrow, half of them would have bandaged thumbs. The Marine riflemen and submachine gunners were coming in, slinging their weapons and lighting cigarettes. A couple of Navy technicians were getting a snooper, a thing shaped like a short-tailed tadpole, 6 feet long by 3 at the widest, fitted with visible light and infrared screen pickups and crammed with detection instruments, ready to relieve the combat car over the village. The contact team crowded into the No. 1 landing craft, which had been fitted out as a temporary headquarters. Prefab hut elements were already being unloaded from the other craft. Everybody felt that a drink was in order, even if it was 2 hours short of cocktail time. They carried bottles and glasses and ice to the front of the landing craft and sat down in front of the battery of view and communication screens. The central screen was a 2-way, tuned to one in the officers' lounge aboard the Hubert Penrose, 200 miles above. In it, also provided with drinks, were Captain Guy Vendinho and 2 other Navy officers, and a Marine captain and shipboard blues. Like Goffredo, Vendinho must have gotten into the service on tiptoe. He had a bald dome and a red beard, and he always looked as though he were gloating because nobody knew that his name was really Rumpelstiltskin. He had been watching the contact by screen. He lifted his glass toward Millard. "Over the hump, Paul?" Millard raised his drink to Vendinho. "Over the first one. There's a whole string of them ahead. At least, we sent them away happy. I hope." "You're going to make permanent camp where you are now?" one of the other officers asked. "Lieutenant Commander Dave Questel, Ground Engineering and Construction Officer. What do you need?" There were 2 view screens from pickups aboard the 2,500-foot battlecruiser. One, at 10 power magnification, gave a map-like view of the broad valley and the uplands and mountain foothills to the south. It was only by tracing the course of the main river and its tributaries that they could find the tiny spot of the native village, and they couldn't see the landing craft at all. The other, at 100 power, showed the oblong mound, with the village on its flat top, little dots around a circular central plaza. They could see the 2 turtle-shaped landing craft, and the combat car, that had been circling over the mound, landing beside them, and, sometimes, a glint of sunlight from the snooper that had taken its place. The snooper was also transmitting in, to another screen, from 200 feet above the village. From the sound outlet came an incessant gibber of native voices. There were over 100 houses, all small and square, with pyramidal roofs. On the end of the mound toward the Terran camp, animals of at least 4 different species were crowded, cattle that had been herded up from the meadows at the first alarm. The open circle in the middle of the village was crowded, and more natives lined the low palisade along the edge of the mound. "Well, we're going to stay here till we learn the language," Millard was saying. "This is the best place for it. It's completely isolated, forests on both sides, and 70 miles to the nearest other village. If we're careful, we can stay here as long as we want to and nobody'll find out about us. Then, after we can talk with these people, we'll go to the big town." The big town was 250 miles down the valley, at the forks of the main river, a veritable metropolis of almost 3,000 people. That was where the treaty would have to be negotiated. But no two of them speak the same language. "You'll want more huts. You'll want a water tank, and a pipeline to that stream below you, and a pump," Questel said. "You think a month?" Millard looked at Lillian Ransby. "What do you think?" "Poodly doodly oodly foodle," she said. "You saw how far we didn't get this afternoon. All we found out was that none of the standard procedures work at all." She made a tossing gesture over her shoulder. "There goes the book, we have to do it off the cuff from here." "Suppose we make another landing, back in the mountains, say 200 or 300 miles south of you," Vindinho said. "It's not right to keep the rest aboard 200 miles off planet, and you won't be wanting liberty parties coming down where you are." "The country over there looks uninhabited," Millard said. "No villages, anyhow. That wouldn't hurt, at all." "Well, it'll suit me," Charlie Loughran, the xenonaturalist, said. "I want a chance to study the life forms in a state of nature." Vindinho nodded. "Luis, do you anticipate any trouble with this crowd here?" he asked. "How about it, Mark? What do they look like to you? Warlike?" "No." He stated the opinion he had formed. "I had a close look at their weapons when they came in for their presents. Hunting arms. Most of the spears have crossguards, usually wooden, lashed on, to prevent a wounded animal from running up the spear shaft at the hunter. They made boar spears like that on Terra 1,000 years ago. Maybe they have to fight raiding parties from the hills once in a while, but not often enough for them to develop special fighting weapons or techniques." "Their village is fortified," Millard mentioned. "I question that," Goffredo differed. "There won't be more than a total of 500 there, call that a fighting strength of 200, to defend a 2,500-meter perimeter, with woodchoppers' axes and bows and spears. If you notice, there's no wall around the village itself. That palisade is just a fence." "Why would they mound the village up?" Questel, in the screen, wondered. "You don't think the river gets up that high, do you?" "Because if it does." Schallenmacher shook his head. "There just isn't enough watershed, and there's too much valley. I'll be very much surprised if that stream, there," he nodded at the 100 power screen, "ever gets more than 6 inches over the bank. I don't know what those houses are built of. This is all alluvial country, building stone would be almost unobtainable. I don't see anything like a brick kiln. I don't see any evidence of irrigation either, so there must be plenty of rainfall. If they use adobe, or sun-dried brick, houses would start to crumble in a few years, and they would be pulled down and the rubble shoved aside to make room for a new house. The village has been rising on its own ruins, probably shifting back and forth from one end of that mound to the other." "If that's it, they've been there a long time," Karl Dorver said. "And how far have they advanced?" "Early bronze, I'll bet they still use a lot of stone implements." pre-dynastic Egypt, or very early Tigris-Euphrates, in Terran terms. I can't see any evidence that they have the wheel. They have draft animals. When we were coming down, I saw a few of them pulling pole travois. I'd say they've been farming for a long time. They have quite a diversity of crops, and I suspect that they have some idea of crop rotation. I'm amazed at their musical instruments. They seem to have put more skill into making them than anything else. I'm going to take a jeep, while they're all in the village, and have a look around the fields, now. Charlie Loughran went along for specimens, and, for the ride, Lillian Ransby. Most of his guesses, he found, had been correct. He found a number of pole travois, from which the animals had been unhitched in the first panic when the landing craft had been coming down. Some of them had big baskets permanently attached. There were drag marks everywhere in the soft ground, but not a single wheel track. He found one plow, cunningly put together with wooden pegs and rawhide lashings. The point was stone, and it would only score a narrow groove, not a proper furrow. It was, however, fitted with a big bronze ring to which a draft animal could be hitched. Most of the cultivation seemed to have been done with spades and hoes. He found a couple of each, bronze, cast flat in an open-top mold. They hadn't learned to make composite molds. There was an even wider variety of crops than he had expected: 2 cereals, a number of different root plants, and a lot of different legumes, and things like tomatoes and pumpkins. Bet these people had a pretty good life here before the Terrans came, Charlie observed. Don't say that in front of Paul, Lillian warned. He has enough to worry about now, without starting him on whether we'll do these people more harm than good. 2 more landing craft had come down from the Hubert Penrose. They found Dave Questel superintending the unloading of more prefab huts, and 2 were already up that had been brought down with the first landing. A name for the planet had also arrived. Svantovit, Karl Dorver told him. Principal god of the Baltic Slavs, about 3,000 years ago. Guy Vendinho dug it out of the Encyclopedia of Mythology. Svantovit was represented as holding a bow in one hand and a horn in the other. Well, that fits. What will we call the natives, Svantovicians, or Svantovese? Well, Paul wanted to call them Svantovese, but Louise persuaded him to call them Svants. He said everybody'd call them that, anyhow, so we might as well make it official from the start. We can call the language Svantovese, Lillian decided. After dinner, I am going to start playing back recordings and running off audiovisuals. I will be so happy to know that I have a name for what I'm studying. Probably be all I will know. After dinner, he and Carl and Paul went into a huddle on what sort of gifts to give the natives, and the advisability of trading with them, and for what. Nothing too far in advance of their present culture level. Wheels, they could be made in the fabricating shop aboard the ship. You know, it's odd, Karl Dorver said. These people here have never seen a wheel, and, except in documentary or historical drama films, neither have a lot of Terrans. That was true. As a means of transportation, the wheel had been completely obsolete since the development of contragravity, 6 centuries ago. Well, a lot of Terrans in the year 0 had never seen a suit of armor, or an harquebus, or even a tinderbox or a spinning wheel. Wheelbarrows, now there was something they'd find useful. He screened Max Milzer, in charge of the fabricating and repair shops on the ship. Max had never even heard of a wheelbarrow. I can make them up, Mark, better send me some drawings, though. Did you just invent it? As far as I know, a man named Leonardo da Vinci invented it, in the 6th century pre-atomic. How soon can you get me half a dozen of them? Well, let's see. Welded sheet metal, and pipe for the frame and handles. I'll have some of them for you by noon tomorrow. Now, about hose, how tall are these people, and how long are their arms, and how far can they stoop over? They were all up late, that night. So were the Svants. There was a fire burning in the middle of the village, and watchfires along the edge of the mound. Luis Gofredo was just as distrustful of them as they were of the Terrans. He kept the camp lighted, a strong guard on the alert, and the area of darkness beyond infrared lighted and covered by photoelectric sentries on the ground and snoopers in the air. Like Paul Millard, Luis Gofredo was a worrier and a pessimist. Everything happened for the worst in this worst of all possible galaxies, and if anything could conceivably go wrong, it infallibly would. That was probably why he was still alive and had never had a command massacred. The wheelbarrows, 4 of them, came down from the ship by mid-morning. With them came a grindstone, a couple of crosscut saws, and a lot of picks and shovels and axes, and cases of sheath knives and mess gear and miscellaneous trade goods, including a lot of the empty wine and whiskey bottles that had been hoarded for the past 4 years. At lunch, the talk was almost exclusively about the language problem. Lillian Ransby, who had not gotten to sleep before sunrise and had just gotten up, was discouraged. "I don't know what we're going to do next," she admitted. "Glenn Orant and Anna and I were on it all night, and we're nowhere. We have about 100 word-like sounds isolated, and 20 or so are used repeatedly, and we can't assign a meaning to any of them. And none of the Svants ever reacted the same way twice to anything we said to them. There's just no one-to-one relationship anywhere." "I'm beginning to doubt they have a language," the Navy intelligence officer said. "Sure, they make a lot of vocal noise. So do chipmunks." "They have to have a language," Anna de Jong declared. "No sapient thought is possible without verbalization." "Well, no society like that is possible without some means of communication," Carl Dorver supported her from the other flank. He seemed to have made that point before. "You know," he added, "I'm beginning to wonder if it mightn't be telepathy." He evidently hadn't suggested that before. The others looked at him in surprise. Anna started to say, "Oh, I doubt if," and then stopped. "I know, the race of telepaths is an old gimmick that's been used in New Planet adventure stories for centuries, but maybe we've finally found one." "I don't like it," Carl, Loughran said. "If they're telepaths, why don't they understand us? And if they're telepaths, why do they talk at all? And you can't convince me that this boodly-oodly doodle of theirs isn't talking." "Well, our neural structure and theirs won't be nearly alike," Phaon said. "I know, this analogy between telepathy and radio is full of holes, but it's good enough for this. Our wavelength can't be picked up with their sets." "The deuce it can't," Gofredo contradicted. "I've been bothered about that from the beginning. These people act as though they got meaning from us. Not the meaning we intend, but some meaning. When Paul made the gobbledygook speech, they all reacted in the same way, frightened, and then defensive. The Yumi routine simply bewildered them, as we'd be at a set of semantically lucid but self-contradictory statements. When Lillian tried to introduce herself, they were shocked and horrified. It looked to me like actual physical disgust, Anna interpolated. When I tried it, they acted like a lot of puppies being petted, and when Mark tried it, they were simply baffled. I watched Mark explaining that steel knives were dangerously sharp, they got the demonstration, but when he tried to tie words onto it, it threw them completely. All right. Past that, Loughran conceded. But if they have telepathy, why do they use spoken words? Oh, I can answer that, Anna said. Say they communicated by speech originally, and developed their telepathic faculty slowly and without realizing it. They'd go on using speech, and since the message would be received telepathically ahead of the spoken message, nobody would pay any attention to the words as such. Everybody would have a spoken language of his own. It would be sort of the instrumental accompaniment to the song. Some of them don't bother speaking, Carl nodded. They just toot. I'll buy that, right away, Lochran agreed. In mating, or in group danger situations, telepathy would be a race survival characteristic. It would be selected for genetically, and the non-gifted strains would tend to die out. It wouldn't do. It wouldn't do at all. He said so. Look at their technology. We either have a young race, just emerged from savagery, or an old, stagnant race. All indications seem to favor the latter. A young race would not have time to develop telepathy as Anna suggests. An old race would have gone much farther than these people have. Progress is a matter of communication and pooling ideas and discoveries. Make a trend graph of technological progress on Terra. Every big jump comes after an improvement in communications. The printing press, railways and steamships, the telegraph, radio. Then think how telepathy would speed up progress. The sun was barely past noon meridian before the Svants, who had ventured down into the fields at sunrise, were returning to the mound village. In the snooper screen, they could be seen coming up in tunics and breechclouts, entering houses, and emerging in long robes. There seemed to be no bows or spears in evidence, but the big horn sounded occasionally. Paul Millard was pleased. Even if it had been by sign talk, which he rated with worm fishing for trout or shooting sitting rabbits, he had gotten something across to them. When they went to the village, at 1500, they had trouble getting their lorry down. A couple of Marines in a jeep had to go in first to get the crowd out of the way. Several of the locals, including the one with the staff, joined with them. This quick cooperation delighted Millard. When they had the lorry down and were all out of it, the dignitary with the staff, his scarlet tablecloth over his yellow robe, began an oration, apparently with every confidence that he was being understood. In spite of his objections at lunch, the telepathy theory was beginning to seem more persuasive. Give them the shooting of Dan McJabberwock again, he told Millard. This is where we came in yesterday. Something Millard had noticed was exciting him. Wait a moment. They're going to do something. They were indeed. The one with the staff and 3 of his henchmen advanced. The staff-bearer touched himself on the brow. Fwunk, he said. Then he pointed to Millard. Hunkle, he said. They got it. Lillian was hugging herself joyfully. I knew they ought to. Millard indicated himself and said, Fwunk. That wasn't right. The village elder immediately corrected him. The word, it seemed, was Fwunk. His 3 companions agreed that that was the word for self, but that was as far as the agreement went. They rendered it, respectively, as Plink, Tweelt and Crush. Gofredo gave a barking laugh. He was right, anything that could go wrong would go wrong. Lillian used a word, it was not a ladylike word at all. The Svants looked at them as though wondering what could possibly be the matter. Then they went into a huddle, arguing vehemently. The argument spread, like a ripple in a pool. Soon everybody was twittering vocally or blowing on flutes and panpipes. Then the big horn started blaring. Immediately, Gofredo snatched the handphone of his belt radio and began speaking urgently into it. What are you doing, Luis? Millard asked anxiously. Calling the reserve in. I'm not taking chances on this. He spoke again into the phone, then called over his shoulder, Renit, 3 one-second bursts, in the air. A Marine pointed a submachine gun skyward and ripped off a string of shots, then another, and another. There was silence after the first burst. Then a frightful howling arose. Luis, you imbecile! Millard was shouting. Gofredo jumped onto the top of an air jeep, where they could all see him. Drawing his pistol, he fired twice into the air. "Be quiet, all of you," he shouted, as though that would do any good. It did. Silence fell, bounced noisily, and then settled over the crowd. Gofredo went on talking to them. "Take it easy, now, easy." He might have been speaking to a frightened dog or a fractious horse. "Nobody's going to hurt you. This is nothing but the great noise magic of the Terrans. Get the presents unloaded," Millard was saying. "Make a big show of it. The table first." The horn, which had started, stopped blowing. As they were getting off the long table and piling it with trade goods, another lorry came in, disgorging 20 Marine riflemen. They had their bayonets fixed. The natives looked apprehensively at the bare steel, but went on listening to Gofredo. Millard pulled the Lord Mayor? Archbishop? Lord of the Manor aside, and began making sign talk to him. When quiet was restored, Howell put a pick and shovel into a wheelbarrow and pushed them out into the space that had been cleared in front of the table. He swung the pick for a while, then shoveled the barrow full of ground. After pushing it around for a while, he dumped it back in the hole and leveled it off. 2 Marines brought out an 8-inch log and chopped a couple of billets off it with an axe, then cut off another with one of the saws, split them up, and filled the wheelbarrow with the firewood. "We can't use the computer till we can tell it what the data is data about. We can't use the computer till we can tell it what the data is data about." The knives, jewelry, and other small items would be no problem. They had enough of them to go around. The other stuff would be harder to distribute, and Paul Millard and Carl Dorver were arguing about how to handle it. If they weren't careful, a lot of new Bowie knives would get bloodied. "Have them form a queue," Anna suggested. "That will give them the idea of equal sharing, and we'll be able to learn something about their status levels and social hierarchy and agonistic relations." The one with the staff took it as a matter of course that he would go first. His associates began falling in behind him, and the rest of the villagers behind them. Whether they'd gotten one the day before or not, everybody was given a knife and a bandana and one piece of flashy junk jewelry, also a stainless steel cup and mess plate, a bucket, and an empty bottle with a cork. The women didn't carry sheath knives, so they got Boy Scout knives on lanyards. They were all lavishly supplied with XT3 and candy. Any of the children who looked big enough to be trusted with them got knives too, and plenty of candy. Anna and Carl were standing where the queue was forming, watching how they fell into line. So was Lillian, with an audiovisual camera. Having seen that the Marine enlisted men were getting the presents handed out properly, Howell strolled over to them. Just as he came up, a couple approached hesitantly, a man in a breechclout under a leather apron, and a woman, much smaller, in a ragged and soiled tunic. As soon as they fell into line, another Svant, in a blue robe, pushed them aside and took their place. "Here, you can't do that," Lillian cried. "Carl, make him step back." Carl was saying something about social status and precedence. The couple tried to get into line behind the man who had pushed them aside. Another villager tried to shove them out of his way. Howell advanced, his right fist closing. Then he remembered that he didn't know what he'd be punching. He might break the fellow's neck, or his own knuckles. He grabbed the blue-robed Svant by the wrist with both hands, kicked a foot out from under him, and jerked, sending him flying for 6 feet and then sliding in the dust for another couple of yards. He pushed the others back, and put the couple into place in the line. "Mark, you shouldn't have done that," Dorver was expostulating. "We don't know." The Svant sat up, shaking his head groggily. Then he realized what had been done to him. With a snarl of rage, he was on his feet, his knife in his hand. It was a Terran Bowie knife. Without conscious volition, Howell's pistol was out and he was thumbing the safety off. The Svant stopped short, then dropped the knife, ducked his head, and threw his arms over it to shield his comb. He backed away a few steps, then turned and bolted into the nearest house. The others, including the woman in the ragged tunic, were twittering in alarm. Only the man in the leather apron was calm. He was saying, tonelessly, "Gru-gru." Luis Gofredo was coming up on the double, followed by 3 of his riflemen. "What happened, Mark? Trouble?" "All over now." He told Gofredo what had happened. Dorver was still objecting. Social precedents, the Svant may have been right, according to local customs. Local customs be damned. Gofredo became angry. "This is a Terran Federation handout, we make the rules, and one of them is, no pushing people out of line. Teach the buggers that now and we won't have to work so hard at it later." He called back over his shoulder, "Situation under control, get the show going again." The natives were all grimacing heartbrokenly with pleasure. Maybe the one who got thrown on his ear, no, he didn't have any, was not one of the more popular characters in the village. "You just pulled your gun, and he dropped the knife and ran?" Gofredo asked. "And the others were scared, too?" "That's right. They all saw you fire yours, the noise scared them." Gofredo nodded. "We'll avoid promiscuous shooting, then. No use letting them find out the noise won't hurt them any sooner than we have to." Paul Millard had worked out a way to distribute the picks and shovels and axes. Considering each house as representing a family unit, which might or might not be the case, there were picks and shovels enough to go around, and an axe for every 3rd house. They took them around in an air jeep and left them at the doors. The houses, he found, weren't adobe at all. They were built of logs, plastered with adobe on the outside. That demolished his theory that the houses were torn down periodically, and left the mound itself unexplained. The wheelbarrows and the grindstone and the 2 crosscut saws were another matter. Nobody was quite sure that the nobility? Capitalist class? Politicians? Prominent citizens wouldn't simply appropriate them for themselves. Paul Millard was worried about that. Everybody else was willing to let matters take their course. Before they were off the ground in their vehicles, a violent dispute had begun, with a bedlam of jabbering and shrieking. By the time they were landing at the camp, the big laminated leather horn had begun to bellow. One of the huts had been fitted as contact team headquarters, with all the view and communication screens installed, and one end partitioned off and soundproofed for Lillian to study recordings in. It was cocktail time when they returned. Conversationally, it was a continuation from lunch. Carl Dorver was even more convinced than ever of his telepathic hypothesis, and he had completely converted Anna de Jong to it. "Look at that." He pointed at the snooper screen, which gave a view of the plaza from directly above. "They're reaching an agreement already." So they seemed to be, though upon what was less apparent. The horn had stopped, and the noise was diminishing. The odd thing was that peace was being restored, or was restoring itself, as the uproar had begun outwardly from the center of the plaza to the periphery of the crowd. The same thing had happened when Gofredo had ordered the submachine gun fired, and, now that he recalled, when he had dealt with the line crasher. "Suppose a few of them, in the middle, are agreed," Anna said. "They are all thinking in unison, combining their telepathic powers. They dominate those nearest to them, who join and amplify their telepathic signal, and it spreads out through the whole group. A mental chain reaction. That would explain the mechanism of community leadership, and I'd been wondering about that," Dorver said, becoming more excited. It's a mental aristocracy, an especially gifted group of telepaths, in agreement and using their powers in concert, implanting their opinions in the minds of all the others. I'll bet the purpose of the horn is to distract the thoughts of the others, so that they can be more easily dominated. And the noise of the shots shocked them out of communication with each other. No wonder they were frightened. Bennett Fayon was far from convinced. So far, this telepathy theory is only an assumption. I find it a lot easier to assume some fundamental difference between the way they translate sound into sense data and the way we do. We think those combs on top of their heads are their external hearing organs, but we have no idea what's back of them, or what kind of a neural hookup is connected to them. I wish I knew how these people dispose of their dead. I need a couple of fresh cadavers. Too bad they aren't warlike. Nothing like a good bloody battle to advance the science of anatomy, and what we don't know about Svant anatomy is practically the entire subject. I should imagine the animals here in the same way, Millard said. When the wagon wheels and the hose and the blacksmith tools come down from the ship, we'll trade for cattle. When they make the second landing in the mountains, I'm going to do a lot of hunting, Lochran added. I'll get wild animals for you. Well, I'm going to assume that the vocal noises they make are meaningful speech, Lillian Ransby said. So far, I've just been trying to analyze them for phonetic values. Now I'm going to analyze them for sound wave patterns. No matter what goes on inside their private nervous systems, the sounds exist as waves in the public atmosphere. I'm going to assume that the Lord Mayor and his stooges were all trying to say the same thing when they were pointing to themselves, and I'm going to see if all four of those sounds have any common characteristic. By the time dinner was over, they were all talking in circles, none of them hopefully. They all made recordings of the speech about the slithy toves in the Malamute saloon. Lillian wanted to find out what was different about them. Luis Gofredo saw to it that the camp itself would be visible lighted, and beyond the lights he set up more photoelectric robot sentries and put a couple of snoopers to circling on contragravity, with infrared lights and receptors. He also insisted that all his own men and all Dave Questel's Navy construction engineers keep their weapons ready to hand. The natives in the village were equally distrustful. They didn't herd the cattle up from the meadows where they had been pastured, but they lighted watchfires along the edge of the mound as soon as it became dark. It was 3 hours after nightfall when something on the indicator board for the robot sentries went off like a startled rattlesnake. Everybody, talking idly or concentrating on writing up the day's observations, stiffened. Luis Gofredo, dozing in a chair, was on his feet instantly and crossing the hut to the instruments. His second-in-command, who had been playing chess with Willie Schallenmacher, rose and snatched his belt from the back of his chair, putting it on. "Take it easy," Gofredo said. "Probably just a cow or a horse local equivalent that strayed over from the other side." He sat down in front of one of the snooper screens and twisted knobs on the remote controls. The monochrome view, transformed from infrared, rotated as the snooper circled and changed course. The other screen showed the camp receding and the area around it widening as its snooper gained altitude. "It's not a big party," Gofredo was saying. "I can't see." "Oh, yes I can. Only 2 of them." The humanoid figures, one larger than the other, were moving cautiously across the fields, crouching low. The snooper went down toward them, and then he recognized them. The man and woman whom the blue-robed villager had tried to shove out of the queue that afternoon. Gofredo recognized them, too. "Your friends, Mark. Harry," he told his subordinate, "go out and pass the word around. Only 2, and we think they're friendly. Keep everybody out of sight, we don't want to scare them away." The snooper followed closely behind them. The man was no longer wearing his apron, the woman's tunic was even more tattered and soiled. She was leading him by the hand. Now and then, she would stop and turn her head to the rear. The snooper over the mound showed nothing but half a dozen fire watchers dozing by their fires. Then the pair were at the edge of the camp lights. As they advanced, they seemed to realize that they had passed a point of no return. They straightened and came forward steadily, the woman seeming to be guiding her companion. "What's happening, Mark?" It was Lillian. She must have just come out of the soundproof speech lab. "You know them, the pair in the queue, this afternoon. I think we've annexed a couple of friendly natives." They all went outside. The two natives, having come into the camp, had stopped. For a moment, the man in the breechclout seemed undecided whether he was more afraid to turn and run than advance. The woman, holding his hand, led him forward. They were both bruised, and both had minor cuts, and neither of them had any of the things that had been given to them that afternoon. "Rest of the gang beat them up and robbed them," Goffredo began angrily. "See what you did?" Dorver began. "According to their own customs, they had no right to be ahead of those others, and now you've gotten them punished for it." "I'd have done more to that fellow than Mark did, if I'd been there when it happened." The Marine officer turned to Millard. "Look, this is your show, Paul, how you run it is your job. But in your place, I'd take that pair back to the village and have them point out who beat them up, and teach the whole gang of them a lesson. If you're going to colonize this planet, you're going to have to establish Federation law, and Federation law says you mustn't gang up on people and beat and rob them. We don't have to speak Svantese to make them understand what we'll put up with and what we won't." Later, Luis. "After we've gotten a treaty with somebody." Millard broke off. "Watch this." The woman was making sign talk. She pointed to the village on the mound. Then, with her hands, she shaped a bucket like the ones that had been given to them, and made a snatching gesture away from herself. She indicated the neckcloths, and the sheath knife and the other things, and snatched them away too. She made beating motions, and touched her bruises and the man's. All the time, she was talking excitedly, in a high, shrill voice. The man made the same grugru noises that he had that afternoon. "No, we can't take any punitive action." "Not now," Millard said. "But we'll have to do something for them." Vengeance, it seemed, wasn't what they wanted. The woman made vehement gestures of rejection toward the village, then bowed, placing her hands on her brow. The man imitated her obeisance, then they both straightened. The woman pointed to herself and to the man, and around the circle of huts and landing craft. She began scuttling about, picking up imaginary litter and sweeping with an imaginary broom. The man started pounding with an imaginary hammer, then chopping with an imaginary axe. Lillian was clapping her hands softly. "Good, got it the first time. You let us stay, we work for you. How about it, Paul?" Millard nodded. "Punitive action's unadvisable, but we will show our attitude by taking them in. You tell them, Luis, these people seem to like your voice." Goffredo put a hand on each of their shoulders. "You, stay, with us." He pointed around the camp. "You, stay, this place." Their faces broke into that funny just before tears expression that meant happiness with them. The man confined his vocal expressions to his odd grugro-ing, the woman twittered joyfully. Goffredo put a hand on the woman's shoulder, pointed to the man and from him back to her. He inquired. The woman put a hand on the man's head, then brought it down to within a foot of the ground. She picked up the imaginary infant and rocked it in her arms, then set it down and grew it up until she had her hand on the top of the man's head again. "That was good, Mom," Goffredo told her. "Now, you and Sonny come along, we'll issue you equipment and find you billets." He added, What in blazes are we going to feed them? XT3. They gave them replacements for all the things that had been taken away from them. They gave the man a one-piece suit of marine combat coveralls, Lillian gave the woman a lavender bathrobe, and Anna contributed a red scarf. They found them quarters in one end of a store shed, after making sure that there was nothing they could get at that would hurt them or that they could damage. They gave each of them a pair of blankets and a pneumatic mattress, which delighted them, although the cots puzzled them at first. What do you think about feeding them, Bennett? Millard asked, when the two Svants had gone to bed and they were back in the headquarters hut. You said the food on this planet is safe for Terrans. So I did, and it is, but the rule's not reversible. Things we eat might kill them, Phaon said. Meats will be especially dangerous. And no caffeine, and no alcohol. Alcohol won't hurt them, Schellenmacher said. I saw big jars full of fermenting fruit mash back of some of those houses. In about a year, it ought to be fairly good wine. C2H5OH is the same on any planet. Well, we'll get native foodstuffs tomorrow, Millard said. We'll have to do that by signs, too, he regretted. Get Mom to help you, she's pretty sharp, Lillian advised. But I think Sonny's the village half-wit. Anna de Jong agreed. Even if we don't understand Svant's psychology, that's evident, he's definitely subnormal. The way he clings to his mother for guidance is absolutely pathetic. He's a mature adult, but mentally he's still a little child. That may explain it. Dorver cried. A mental defective, in a community of telepaths, constantly invading the minds of others with irrational and disgusting thoughts, no wonder he is rejected and persecuted. And in a community on this culture level, the mother of an abnormal child is often regarded with superstitious detestation.